In this video, I'm going to be showing you guys how you can do the stitched loop for your friendship bracelets. Here's what it looks like on an alpha bracelet. Here's what it looks like on a normal pattern bracelet. And here it is on an alpha keychain. So it works for all types of bracelets. So we're going to go ahead and start out on how to do this. So I have my base strings cut for my bracelet here. Whatever you're going to be making, if you're making a normal pattern, all your base strings are going to be different colors. But if you're making an alpha pattern, your base strings will probably all be the same color. And then you're going to go ahead and grab your background string. I'm using this bright orange. For a normal pattern, we'll just pretend that these are all my strings for my normal pattern that I'm going to make. You know, usually your base strings are all cut at the same length, same sizes, everything like that. However, if you're going to do the stitched loop for a normal pattern, you're going to want to make one of your base strings, I'd say maybe around 7 to 8 inches longer than the rest of your strings. This is going to be the string that we use to actually make the stitched loop. You're going to need extra thread for that. For normal patterns, one string out of all of your strings for your bracelet will need to be slightly longer. Whatever string you want to be the color of your stitched loop, that string will need to be longer. For alphas, you will just use whatever background color you're going to use. For alpha patterns, I would recommend using the same color base strings as your background color. Just when you get into doing other techniques like these triangle ends here, these triangle ends are actually made using the base strings, not the background color. So when you have them the same color, it looks nicer. If these base strings were a different color, then it would look weird. But right now I'm doing 2 different colors for my base strings and my background color, so you guys can easily differentiate in the video. So once you have everything set out, go ahead and fold all of your base strings in half, and we're gonna go ahead and start the stitch loop. So with my strings folded in half, I just take a piece of tape and I kind of mark about how big I want the loop to be, and then put my tape down on one side of the base strings, and then we're gonna tape that like this. If you're doing a normal pattern, you're going to want to make sure that the base strings that are hanging down here are the ones that have the slightly longer strand, so you can actually stitch your stitch loop. But if you're doing an alpha, you're going to take your background color and you're going to just kind of group with the rest of your base strings. And I'd recommend leaving a good 3 or 4 inches because we're going to stitch this tail back into our bracelet. So I have base strings and I have my background string to do the actual stitched loop. Again, if it's a normal pattern, it's just going to be one of your base strings, whichever one you cut to be longer. And I also want to clarify that this stitch loop that we're doing right now is if you have an even number of base strings. I will show you how to do an odd number later on. And once you have this down, I always put the string I'm using for my stitched loop on the left-hand side. So I always start with a forward knot, and I'm doing a forward knot over all of my base strings like so. If your stitched loop string is on the right-hand side, then you would do a backward knot first, whatever. After I did my first forward knot, I'm gonna follow that up with a backward knot. And I'm going to repeat that same step. I'm going to do a forward, and then I'm going to do a backward. And then I'm going to do another forward, and I'm going to do another backward. And as you can see, our knots are starting to take shape. And when we keep repeating this step, it's going to create the length of our stitched loop. So I'm going to go ahead and keep doing these knots, making sure that I'm doing the knots over all of my base strings here, just like that, until this is long enough. Once you have created a length of all of your knots, sometimes I like to kind of just bend it like this, and you can kind of see that our loop is taking place. So this looks like a pretty good size for me. Depending on how many base strings you do have will kind of depend on how big your loop needs to be. If you have a smaller number of base strings, you can get away with a bit of a smaller loop, but if you have a really thick bracelet, you're gonna want a much bigger loop. So once you're happy with the length, then I'm going to go ahead and remove this tape here. And we have something that looks like this. We're going to go ahead and fold that into our loop shape. and then tape it down like that. And then from here, you're gonna go ahead and start your bracelet. And as you can see, we have this little tail going on. So when you actually go to make your bracelet, I'm gonna do something really, really wonky here, you guys. But what I do, if this is an alpha, same thing if you're doing with a normal pattern. It's a little bit more finicky with a normal pattern, but if you're doing it with an alpha, I just like to pair this tail with one of my bass strings, and then when I go to do my knots over it, I just group them together and do my full knots like that. So that way they're grouped together, and then I will usually do a couple of rows with this tail in there. And then once I've done a couple rows, I'll just leave the tail out. I'll keep making my knots, and then I will end up cutting this tail off. Kind of the same thing with normal patterns. You'll just kind of group that tail with one of your strings, kind of do a couple knots with it, and then cut it off. That's how to do the stitch to loop with an even number of bass strings. I'm gonna go ahead and show you guys how to do the stitch to loop with an odd number of bass strings. This is the pattern I'm making. So it has 17 bass strings, and I need to remove one so that it's at an even number so I can cut my strings. So we're gonna remove one, so that means 16 is the number of bass strings I'm cutting for. And as we know, when we're cutting our strings for our bracelets, we cut them double as long as we need to, and then we end up folding them in half. So I cut 8 strings, folded them in half, so now I have 16. I'm going to kind of measure out the size that I want my loop to be, tape it down. This is also for an alpha pattern, by the way, and tape it down like this. Now, as of right now, we only have 16 bass strings. So in order to get the 17, I'm gonna take my background color, and I am using the same color as my bass string, so hopefully it's not too confusing. But the only difference that you're gonna do with this when you have an odd number of strings is instead of using your background string and just creating a little tail, you are actually going to elongate that string and line it up with your bass strings, just like that. And then we're gonna tape this down and then start making our loop from here. So basically we just added an additional bass string. So instead of having 16, I have 17. And then from here, you will just do your stitch to loop like normal, and you won't have any loose tails that you need to thread back in because we made it an actual bass string. All right, now we're gonna do stitch to loop with an odd number of strings for a normal pattern. It's a little bit different than an alpha and a little bit more complicated, so hopefully you guys can stay with me here. I've just cut my strings for a wave bracelet pattern. So for the wave bracelet, we need 5 white strings and then 3 blue strings. So I subtract 1 from each of those to get an even number. So we subtract 1 from 5 white strings to get 4 white strings. So I cut 2 super long white strings, fold those in half to get 4. And then we're gonna subtract 1 from 3 blue strings to get 2 blue strings. I'm gonna cut 1 super long blue string, fold that in half to get 2. So now we have these additional extras. So once our strings are folded in half, I'm going to cut 1 extra of each of the colors. So when you cut your 1 additional string, that's the length of your strings folded in half. You're gonna make sure that you leave some extra tails on the end. So in total, I have 3 blue strings, and then I have 5 white strings. Once they're folded in half, we're gonna go ahead and do our stitched loop. And you're basically just going to take these tails and just fold them over so they can act like they're real strings, but they're actually just tails. And it's gonna be the same process. We're gonna kind of measure out a loop. We're gonna tape that down, making sure that on the top we have those tails right there. And then where we're actually making the stitched loop is on the other side without the tails. And I did make sure to cut one of my threads longer than the rest of them because this is the string I'm gonna be using for my stitched loop. So I'm gonna just separate that from the rest of them. This time my string is kind of on the right side, so I'm gonna actually start with a backward knot and then a forward. And then I'm just gonna keep repeating this until my loop is my desired length. All right, once I have made my knots and it is my desired length, we're gonna go ahead and kind of flatten this out here. So there's my little loop. And when you go ahead and start making your bracelet, it's the same thing. We're gonna have those little tails in with our regular strings. So it's gonna be pretty much just the same thing. You're just going to kind of pair them up with your strings and just try to kind of weave them back into your bracelet a little bit. And then after you've done a couple knots with them, then you can go ahead and just snip them off. So that was my stitch loop tutorial. Hopefully this was helpful for you guys. If you have any additional questions, feel free to leave them down below, and I will see you guys later. Bye guys.